And you're not connected to
Right.
the camera or mic.
But it's on, it's working. So here's what I think I'm gonna do.
You're gonna try switching it
I
again.
think I'm gonna try, yeah. And I'm sorry, John. To make you,
Yeah, okay, let me check.
yeah, feel free to.
See that carrot right there, integrated webcam, blur your background, gotta turn that off. And now we'll leave it until you reconnect and hopefully it'll.
Okay. All right. So here is yours back, John.
Yep.
Sorry, and thank you again. Let's see if we can oh, and I still have your mouse over here. I apologize.
Oh, you want it?
Was it the do you know which speaker array it would be?
So yeah, what
Is
is
it
it?
the echo canceling and then
Yes,
the
I would
echo?
say start with that one.
Oops. And this one has that as well.
Yeah, it's Jody.
It's some. It's in limited duration. Yeah, I think, did I see Jody?
Yeah, Jody.
Okay.
Jeremy.
You get these clubs, you play all the time, they play year round, play in other states. Yeah. When my kids were growing up, you're starting to drive.
So we have cabinet meeting in one. Right, so after.
We used to just
right,
go out on the
so
street
that's-
and find a group to play them all. Right.
It's one information. Yeah. Yeah, so we're extended. Yes, I'm not exactly sure.
Diversity of activities.
CMS system, the system is.
When he was young. Yeah, that's one of the.
Heather's gonna be here. She is.
He practiced on a team. Hi,
Bill,
Jody.
are you able to hear me?
Can you wave?
Can you hear us, Jody?
Yeah, I can. I can't see anybody. I can't see the room.
That's it. Dedicated to soccer, that injury. You know, still play, still good, but he's not gonna be.
It should not be like.
Is he okay? Yeah, he dominated me last year. Really? Yeah.
The screens are pretty. Lots of them.
You're in a practice.
Yeah. I
There's not
Points.
No.
over it. That's what I thought. Any of those are H2.
Yeah.
They're not covered under it. They were exempt.
Let's check it out. I don't think so. There is, you know, it does.
Just lingered, that'd be a one round bout.
There you are.
Yeah. These are pretty chill, so yeah. We're down a little bit in numbers in our booth, but the range.
US citizens to start with.
Yeah.
Isolate there, basically, just go to the dining.
Which is good, because my brain is more potato harvest than it is Biggie at this point. With the rain, and finally being able to get in the field this week is.
So this week in particular?
We started at farm and started on Thursday. It was terrible. Yeah, we had one tractor that was just pulling out trucks. Oh, yeah, that bad. Yeah, you couldn't turn on the headlamps at all. The second you drove on the headlamps, they sunk. Yeah, yeah. But pretty much everybody this week. Is the first.
Yeah.
And then there is a definition of farm, but.
On the right of your screen, see if it starts.
Dylan.
Like no more rain the next couple weeks.
You bet. How's it been? Good to see you. Wow. Yeah. Been out here for a while.
Okay.
Dylan, I have a question for you. How many rows of the audience are there behind Mike Rowland?
You're not in a screen sharing.
Dylan, are you able to hear me?
And on the back of the processing. Or half the good on the chance to produce. Then it's mostly your commercial packaging and process.
Right.
Yeah, although it can cover those two.
Yeah. It's comfortable.
It is a business farming situation, you're not sure of. So that they can look at it.
Interesting.
Really, really.
Thanks, Tom.
I switched the audio output source.
He's your substitute.
Ceiling mics are.
Okay, so.
There you go.
Are you able to hear me now, Dylan?
He's got some other brush.
Jody, can you hear me now?
What's that? I can hear you. I can hear.
Podcasting audio to whoever's on Zoom, but what we're not getting back is
I hear you very clearly, Jody.
Your name tag, did you?
Thank you.
You and I can talk to one another.
Right.
You have a marker here.
We'll solve the problem.
John, do we have a marker?
There. Yeah, so they're on, that's how they're going to participate.
start.
See you again. You must be
Start the
exhausted.
webinar.
I'm tired.
That open. Yeah.
It's amazing.
I think it
It's always. Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, I always try to get.
We're gonna grab another one.
Yeah, we're right at 1 o'clock. We're still testing the equipment and a couple of folks we were anticipating are not here yet, so hopefully they'll be joining momentarily.
I just sent a message to everybody, letting them know that we're troubleshooting audio, but we are open. We have panelists on. I'm just trying to figure out the audio. They can hear us and see us. We cannot hear them for whatever reason. So I'm trying to figure out the speakers in the room, hearing us, right? So, or hearing them rather.
Panelists may need to use a raise hand function and then type in chat in order to convey their comments until.
Yeah, let's give it another minute or two then. Try removing. I was there.
It was hiding under.
I was like, that's what I thought it might be.
Oh.
Now you go back.
I
I was gonna say, take that with you.
Very good too.
If it happens again, it won't be with you. We'll just we'll give the backup Arthur Phillips to
Flip side is empty,
Whoever.
still available.
Yeah, there you
So
go. There's really like 3 more.
that is.
Okay, and the reason we're waiting, Penny, is we're having some technology issues.
Apologies, everybody. I'm really trying.
That's not muted now.
Yeah. Hey, Jody, can you say something?
Hello there.
Absolutely.
Did that help? Nope.
Sorry.
Okay, it's 1:03. We've already violated one of our first rules of engagement, which is we will start promptly. Let's give it another 2 minutes, and if we can't, it's my understanding the folks who are on the line can hear us and see us, but we just
Hey
can't
there.
hear them.
Hey, I just figured, I can text you with any observations or major concerns. Otherwise, I'm useless.
That's indicated they are.
All right, thanks.
Let's start with introductions here. Yeah. Okay, so folks will continue to troubleshoot again, as I said. Anyone online can see us, they can hear us. We will also be recording the session. I think that we're able to do that, so folks will be able to view this afterward, and we have been posting on the website copies of all materials that are distributed at these meetings, as well as video of the recording. So and I think, so I'm Laura Fortman. I'm the Commissioner of the Maine Department of Labor, and I have the pleasure of co-chairing this stakeholder group with my colleague from the Department of Agriculture, Conservation and Forestry, DACF, Nancy McBrady. And in our defense, this building is not one that either of us uses. We had our colleagues at Marine Resources, I believe, are letting us use this space because of the high tech that they have available to them that neither of us have in our spaces. We may decide to go back to low tech if we can't figure this out, though. So Nancy, do you want to?
Sure. Welcome everybody to the second meeting. Appreciate being able to continue the conversation today. As the agenda reflects, there's going to be a continuation of explanation about laws particular to agricultural employers, and allow for conversations as well amongst ourselves as members, and hopefully by members of the public later this afternoon. For those who are here for the first time, welcome. We've had the opportunity to review some documents in advance. And we're just going to briefly go around the table so everyone can introduce themselves and their affiliation for the record. We start with you, Heather, and congratulations on a successful fair.
I'm Juana Rodriguez Vasquez. I'm the Executive Director of Mano and Mano.
I'm Shelley McGuire. I'm the Policy and Research Director at Maine Farmland Trust.
I'm Ann Macri. I am an Assistant Attorney General and I represent the Bureau of Labor Standards.
Hey everyone, I'm Matt Schlobaum, Executive Director at the Maine FLCAO.
Arthur Phillips, an analyst with the Maine Center for Economic Policy.
I'm Penny Jordan. I'm one of the owners of Jordan's Farm in Cape Elizabeth, and I'm representing Maine Farm Bureau.
I'm Mike Tipping. I represent Senate District 8 and Senate President Jackson sends his regrets.
Ollie Francis was Passam 40 Wild Blueberry Company representing Darren.
And online, I know we have at least one other and probably two other committee members.
Can you hear me?
Yes. Hi, Heath.
Okay. All right. So I'm Heath Miller and I'm representing Maine Dairy Industry Association. And I'm sorry I can't be there in person today. I'm just trying to save a little time. Thank goodness we have the Zoom option now.
Thank you. And
good afternoon. My name is Tom Harnett. I'm here representing Speaker Rachel Talbot Ross.
thank you. And do we have any other committee members online? No, okay.
One person we should recognize who's not here, but has been a key help with this effort is Jody Sapphire. She is a special assistant within the Commissioner's Office, the Department of Agriculture, Conservation and Forestry. She's unable to be here today. She has lended her facilitation skills, and now that audio is working, we invite her to help facilitate this meeting as much as Commissioner Fortman and I in person will take the laboring oar with that. So with that, also wanted to acknowledge that in the materials that you were presented with today, of which there are copies for members of the public, there was a brief overview of meeting notes from the first meeting. I don't believe that we need to vote to accept these, but just wanted to mention that they're there. If anyone has any issues or glaring corrections to make, just please let us know. Otherwise, happy to move forward with our first presentations.
And those meeting notes are online as well. So all of the information that's shared here is public information, and we are posting everything as quickly as we can, as well as I said earlier, recording these meetings. So I think right with that, I want to turn it over to Jody, I think, to review the working agreement that we discussed last time and a quick agenda review.
Sure. Are you able to hear me? Oh, awesome. Hi, everybody. So sorry not to be there. I'm on the tail end of COVID, so we'll try not to be coughing at you too much. You received prior to last meeting the draft working agreements, which you then approved at the first meeting. And we just want to do a quick review of this, and we're going to do that at the beginning of every meeting just to ground ourselves in the way to be most efficient and productive in your work together. So these meetings are public and all comments are on the record, and the meeting has already begun to be recorded and it will be posted to the website, as was the last meeting's recording. We're doing our best to start meetings on time, and we'll certainly end today's meeting on time. And there was a little bit of a confusion on the end time of this meeting, but it's correct in the agenda, and we'll wrap up by 3:30 today. We're doing our best to meet in person whenever there is a meeting held in person, just to facilitate understanding as much as possible, understanding that there are extenuating circumstances that can make that difficult periodically. And we're keeping, for those of us online, we're keeping our cameras on, just again to facilitate communication. We're doing our best to share meetings about a week in advance, and we mentioned at the last meeting that we won't be able to do that for the next meeting because the next meeting is a week from today. We're going to get those out as quickly as possible after today's meeting, but you'll have a shorter time frame between these two meetings. We hope that you've come prepared, having read materials, and that you're really fully phones away and being fully engaged. And for those of us who tend to be quiet in meetings, we're hoping that you'll speak out and so that we can hear everyone's perspective. And for those of you who are more talkers, just feel free to, if you would, sort of sit back and see if some of your concerns get raised by others. And then ultimately, you know, the point of this process is to really facilitate understanding and an openness to learning. So we hope that you gain something from every meeting, from presentations and also from your fellow committee members. If you have concerns about something, if you disagree with something, we hope you'll absolutely raise that, but also raise it kindly. And then last but not least, we hope that these meetings are actually fun and that you'll feel free to insert humor, appropriate humor, wherever you like. So so that's that on the meeting agreements. And you're going to have the benefit of 3 different presentations today from Deputy Attorney General Ann Macri, and then many members of the Department of Labor and from the Maine Workers' Compensation Board. Excuse me. And this is really to get grounded on existing employment laws that are applicable to agricultural employers. And we'll make sure that after that, we have ample time for discussion, both during those that first session, but then after the presentations, finally taking a pulse on the number of people who would like to weigh in from the public. And we'll do our best to accommodate all of those. If we run out of time, we'll make sure we come up with another way for you to get your concerns and points across. And that is that. So unless I've missed something, we can right into presentations.
Right, and the only thing, thank you so much, Jody, for re-grounding us. And the only thing that I do want to say is that the Assistant Attorney General, Ann Macri, wanted to make it clear that that is her title. She's not trying to usurp any authority over at the Attorney General's office.
I forgot the other A.
Thank you.
And Ann, I didn't know if you wanted Mike to.
Yeah, Mike, do you want to come?
Oh, and let me just, while you're doing that, Mike, let me just note that because we've got Heath and Tom on the line, if you could just raise your hands, that raised hand function whenever you like, so that we can see you and we make sure that you're an integral part of the conversation.
Okay. So Dylan is bringing up the presentation. Thank you.
I think I'm gonna stand.
You want to stand?
My
Okay.
part, if you want to, but.
Sure. I did want to just flag, it says on your agenda here that this is being presented by Scott Cottonwar. Scott is the director of the Wage and Hour Division. He was not able to make it today, so Mike is going to.
You'll have to put up with me. I know some of you have probably seen too much of me in the recent past, but I'll plow on anyway.
And you might want to say who you are.
I am the director of the Bureau of Labor Standards in the Maine Department of Labor. It's good to see all of you. Appreciate your coming. So Ann and I today have the intention of presenting sort of an overview of wage and hour law in Maine. And those would be the regulation of employment statutes, our chapter 7. It's the chapter within the state laws that we mostly work with. And what we're doing is reviewing those statutes within chapter 7 that apply currently to agriculture, to agricultural employers and employees. And after we do that, we will cover briefly the status of Maine minimum wage statute law. And currently, and then if it were to be changed in ways that we're about to discuss in future meetings, what that would look like briefly, because that's something we'll get back to probably repeatedly in the next several meetings. So that's the outline of what we're here to talk about today. And Dylan, if you could flip one and then another slide forward. I'll hand it over to him.
Thanks. So we wanted to give folks a little bit of an overview of what we mean when we talk about wage and hour law. We have both federal and state law in this area. In Maine, our wage and hour law is contained within Chapter 7. There are approximately 70 statutes contained within that we consider, broadly speaking, wage and hour law. These are worker protective remedial statutes. They are intended to provide baseline protections for workers. However, they do also function to create a level playing field for all businesses to succeed. The interaction between state and federal law, there are areas where there is federal regulation, there are areas where there's state regulation, there are areas where there are both. The FLSA sets a floor, the Federal Fair Labor Standards Act sets a floor, and state law can regulate in areas where the federal government does not. In general, where there are more than one law, the more protective applies. And you look to federal law and federal regulation for interpretive guidance, and to sort of fill in gaps at times where there may be federal guidance on something that state law does not have guidance on. The presumptive application of state law is that it
I've just, Tom, can you hear me?
Yes, I can,
Yeah.
but I
and you're not-
lost audio for quite a while. Oh, you're just talking to me.
I am just talking to you, and I've lost it as well. I'm sure you have as well, Keith.
Yes. but
Yeah,
I guess we can
and I've just
only
sent a
hear
note to
ourselves.
Dylan.
Okay, I was just typing a text, but we have enough going on.
Yeah, we'll see if he gets us back.
I'll-
Poor guy. Jesus, we can hear you all.
We'll be,
for your
we'll be
information.
we'll be careful what we say then.
Yeah, well, speak kindly of you, Dylan. We can't hear a thing.
You're gonna try to back up to where they dropped out?
Yeah, I'm not sure where they dropped out. We'll have to get them back.
And can they hear us now?
Yes, we can. We can hear you, and we really didn't catch any of the presentation.
We can apparently have one or the other, but not the other.
They didn't hear us. I mean, maybe.
Okay.
Yeah.
Can you ask them via chat, where did they lose us? I'll take a step back.
Really, everybody blame me for this. I don't know what's going on here.
At the very beginning.
Did Jody say that we're meeting next Monday? Yes. I just, sorry, I missed that. I had to check. It's
Remote.
I think it was remotely. It's a remote meeting.
Yeah,
It's virtual. I think on the website, we also have all of the dates on there, I hope.
I just plugged it into the
It's-
calendar wrong.
This, when you mentioned 70 statutes in chapter 7.
Go back to the beginning of this slide. Okay, so wage and hour law in Maine, we have approximately 70 statutes. They are contained within Title 26, Chapter 7. We also have federal, statute in this area. The Federal Fair Labor Standards Act generally sets a floor, and states can regulate more protective laws. They can regulate in areas that the federal government does not. These are worker protective remedial laws, which are intended to provide baseline protections to workers. However, they also are intended to create a level playing field for all businesses to be able to succeed. Where we have federal and state law, whichever is more protective is going to apply. We do look to federal law in some areas for guidance, for interpretation, to sort of fill in gaps where we have a lot of overlapping law. The presumptive application of wage and hour law is that it applies to all employers and all workers. And what we mean by that is that if someone is a business that is hiring someone to perform services for them, we are going to consider that person an employer, that business an employer, unless there is an applicable exemption that makes them not an employer. And on the worker side, if there is someone who's performing services for wages, for compensation, we are going to consider that person a worker, an employee, unless there is an exemption that applies to that worker. The Wage and Hour Division conducts investigations. Those investigations may be conducted based on complaints that come in, random inspections, and also strategic enforcement priorities. Strategic enforcement priorities include areas, typical industries where we know there are high violations, areas where we know there are a lot of low wage workers who have less access to advocacy, or for instance, areas where we may have a lot of workers who English is not their first language, something like that. So there are a variety of those. Next slide.
Okay, so a little bit about our investigative process, as Ann was just saying. Most of our investigations begin as complaints. And most complaints begin as really inquiries. Workers who call us or email us or otherwise report what they suspect might be a violation, or just to determine whether they have a certain protection or benefit under the law. We also occasionally receive tips from other than workers. So that might stimulate an investigation. For instance, the parent of a minor working in a certain situation, or others, customers who might observe an incident or a problem that they want to find out more about. And they'll call us. We'll develop the information, usually on the phone or in some other conversation with the person. And if it looks like it's a possible violation of one of our statutes, we'll continue and do an actual investigation in most cases. Some cases, it's not a violation of our statute, but we see something else that it might refer to, and we'll refer that person to that agency, sometimes the U.S. Department of Labor, sometimes Workers' Compensation, another department in state government, or OSHA, so that they can pursue what looks like it might be a violation of their laws. So if an investigation is initiated, the safety and health inspector, or rather the safety and labor inspector, will usually contact the employer, ask them to produce records, try to determine whether there was a misunderstanding or an actual violation occurred. Maybe the employer is willing to correct it. If not, we'll continue to do an investigation and determine whether or not to cite the employer. We accept anonymous complaints, and we always try to protect the identity of the worker complaining. If it becomes impossible to do that, if the investigation proceeds to a point where it's obvious who's complaining, we'll consult with the worker first and make sure that they're comfortable in that situation in case they're still working at the location. And so then we'll review those records. And if we think it's necessary, we'll cite the employer and try to correct the situation. Back pay is our priority. And sometimes penalties also emerge in order to prevent future violations. Next slide.
Okay, so as I mentioned, we have approximately 70 statutes within Chapter 7 that make up wage and hour law. However, We generally see issues and violations happening in a much smaller number of statutes, right? We have a number of areas that are our sort of frequent flyers. So in terms of just giving some overall context of the type of issues that we see, these numbers are drawn from the Wage and Hour Division's annual report. If you are interested in seeing more data, those annual reports are on the BLS website. These are the numbers from 2022. I will say these numbers are somewhat approximated because there's actually a little bit more data in here, but these are summarized. So where we tend to see the issues, the top numbers on this slide are the statutes that are applicable to agriculture. So timely and full payment of wages, that is probably our number one single statute that we see issues with. And that basically means areas where people have not gotten a paycheck or their paycheck was late or perhaps their paycheck bounced. Record keeping, that's 622. We also see a high number of violations in that area, high number of issues that come up in that area. And that one often is part of what happens in investigations because records are not true and accurate. We also see child labor violations. You may have seen some reporting this year on a national level. Child labor is sort of a hot topic at the moment, and we are seeing increasing issues and reports with child labor. Misclassification, very broadly, that is the issue of whether someone is classified as an employee versus an independent contractor. And then we see a small number of sort of a variety of other statutes. On the bottom there, you see approximately 32% of our total violations involve subchapter 3. Subchapter 3 is the section of chapter 7 that contains minimum wage, overtime, payment of tips, and records. As we have discussed previously, that is the subchapter that individuals employed in agriculture are currently exempt from. Of that 32%, roughly half of those violations involve either tips or overtime. And I flagged that mainly because the last version of the statute also contained a separate exemption for overtime. So we're really not going to talk about overtime very much, but I did just want to sort of flag that.
Okay, the next three slides are sort of a piece, but we'll dwell on them one at a time. And so referring back to what Ann said initially, there are around 70 separate statutes protecting workers in our chapter 7. And they kind of boil down to about 40 different subject areas. We initially had all 40 on one slide, but we knew that would probably be illegible in this space, and we wanted to expand it out. So that's why 3 slides. This would be the first one, and I'm just giving you a minute to take a look at it so that you see the content, roughly of our statutes that protect agricultural workers as well as other workers. All of these statutes apply to agriculture. Next slide, Dylan. So here's another slide. You'll see that some of the statutes that Ann referred to as the most common violations are in on this slide. So I'll give you a minute to look at that and see if there are any questions about any of these particular statutes. All right, next slide, Dylan. So again, this is the remainder of that roughly 40 group of statutes or subchapters that apply to agricultural workers as well as all other workers in Maine. If there are any questions, Ann and I will take them now, but we can save until the end if you want. Go ahead.
Can we just go to the first one again?
Yeah, back to the first. Thanks.
Are we getting a copy of the slide?
Yes.
Yeah, you'll be getting all copies of all the presentations, I believe. Yeah,
The summary of the 5,000 or so complaints that are received in 2022, those are of any of these 70 statutes.
they could be,
Okay.
yeah.
Collectively.
They could. There are some statutes that rarely are violated, or we rarely have a complaint, I guess I'd say, on those statutes, but they all could. Okay, having done
And
that,
Mike, to just restate, this is existing law. These are things that are currently.
current existing law that does apply to workers across the board unless they're specifically exempted. Yes.
These 40 farm workers are exempted from or applies?
No, these are the statutes that do apply to farm workers and all workers, unless there's a specific exemption, which there is not for agriculture under these statutes. Good question. Thanks for helping me clarify that. So if that's clear, violations and enforcement. So you see at the top, there are a number of mechanisms for enforcing penalties among them. And our penalties range from $25 to $50,000. But that said, most of them are within that $50 to $100 range. And we do have the ability to apply all or some of the penalties, depending on the situation, at our discretion. The workers in some cases can also take private rights of action, as they can move forward through a court without our participation. Our priority, as I said, is to get back wages paid, wages that should have been paid in the first place, but weren't by the employer. And then if we feel it's appropriate, in some cases, we can assess liquidated damages, meaning adding 2 or sometimes 3 times the amount of the unpaid wage to be paid back to the worker. And in an extreme situation, and rarely used, but with the recent legislation and within restricted boundaries, we can issue cease operations, or otherwise known as a stop work order, when there's a particularly egregious or repeated violation. Also, I would add that some of our statutes contain an anti-retaliation provision so that a worker can't be punished or otherwise retaliated against for trying to assert their rights under the law. And the legislature in the last session passed a blanket anti-retaliation provision so that we can assure workers from the outset, before we even know what statute is in question, that they'll be protected against retaliation.
That's blanket, so it applies to farm workers as well.
It applies to all workers unless they're accepted under the statute. But the anti-retaliation is broad enough that before we know whether there's a violation, if we see retaliation, we can act against that as well. Next slide.
Can I ask a question before you move on?
Yeah, please.
So you had talked about protecting the confidentiality of the complainant, like if someone was issuing a complaint and was on the employee side. What about for the employer? If there is a violation and there's a penalty, is that employer's confidentiality also protected?
Yes, we have a very broad confidentiality statute that covers all of our investigations up until the point that they become what's called final bureau action. And at that point, we can make them public, and we usually do. And I'll let Anne elaborate on that because she's really the expert.
So generally speaking, if a citation letter is issued, it is considered final bureau action, and those are posted quarterly on the BLS website. There's a violations website, and that information is going to include the name of the employer, the type of violation, the penalties involved. Also, in certain circumstances, we do settlement agreements where we may suspend a portion of a penalty in exchange for compliance. And the settlement agreements also become final bureau action and become public documents. Okay, so we've sort of covered the range of the statutes that currently apply to employers and employees in agriculture. We want to talk a little bit about subchapter 3. So subchapter 3 does not currently apply to individuals employed in agriculture. There is a specific exemption, which the citation is at the bottom of this slide, that exempts individuals employed in agriculture from the entirety of subchapter 3. So what does subchapter 3 involve? Subchapter 3 establishes the obligation to pay minimum wage, currently $13.80. It also includes overtime. As I said, we're really not going to talk about overtime in great detail because in the bill that was vetoed, there was a separate exemption, a different exemption that was inserted that changed the rules around overtime or exempted individuals employed in agriculture from overtime specifically. However, there are a couple of other pieces of subchapter 3 in addition to minimum wage. One is the requirement to keep true and accurate records. This is additional to the other record keeping statute that already applies, 622. It is very similar, however, it requires that employers keep true and accurate records of the hours worked by each employee and the wages paid. It also requires employers to provide a pay statement, which basically says those same things. It has to state the number of hours worked, the total wages paid, and any itemized deductions.
So Anne, how's that different than the statute that folks are already covered?
622.
Yeah.
So the real difference is that 622 requires daily hours, whereas this requires the specific hours. So it's a nuanced difference, and most payroll companies, most payroll systems are going to be compliant with both. And then this is the place where you have the pay statement. The existing statute 622 doesn't have that pay statement requirement. It requires that the employers keep the records, but it doesn't require the pay statement.
So I'd have to keep the record, but if Nancy was working for me, I wouldn't have to give her a copy of it.
Yeah.
Under current law.
Right. 622 doesn't require essentially a pay stub, which 665 does.
Okay.
So that's what this is requiring a pay stub. And that pay stub has to include the date of the pay period, the hours worked, the total wages earned, and then any itemized deductions. And then the last piece of subchapter 3 is just a section that basically says that employees and employers cannot agree essentially to exempt themselves from the statute, right? The statute is the statute, the requirements are the requirements. They can't agree to, say this doesn't apply to us. So I'm gonna pause there for questions and then. Okay, seeing none. So next slide, Dawn. Thank you. So what is the effect if we take that exemption that is in 663, the individuals employed in agriculture being exempt from subchapter 3? If we remove that exemption, what happens? Well, the first thing is that all those things we just discussed, minimum wage, the pay stub requirement, those things become applicable to individuals employed in agriculture. However, there are 2 other laws that would apply as a result of removing that exemption. These laws are not part of subchapter 3. The reason that they become applicable is because they do currently have an exemption within their own terms where they're borrowing from subchapter 3, basically, right? So those laws, even though they're not in subchapter 3, have sort of imported their definitions from subchapter 3. So if that definition goes away, that exemption goes away, then these laws become applicable. The first one is rest breaks. The second one is limits on mandatory overtime. The rest break statute, this is 601, requires that employees must be given the opportunity to take a 30-minute break, it can be unpaid, after working 6 hours. There are some exemptions within that statute that apply or may apply in certain circumstances. One is emergencies, if there is a danger to property, life, public safety, or public health. And the other is to small employers in workplaces where there are fewer than 3 employees on duty at any given time, and where the employees have the opportunity to take more frequent paid breaks of a shorter duration. So instead of getting one longer break, they get more frequent paid breaks. The other statute is section 603. This is limits on mandatory overtime. This basically states that employers cannot require that employees work more than 80 hours of overtime in a consecutive 2-week period. So that's really 160 hours total. Voluntary overtime is not limited. There are also some additional exceptions within that statute that apply, one of which applies to seasonal employers. And then there are some other ones. So we're going to go through some of this stuff in more detail next week. But these are the other statutes that do become applicable if we remove the exemption. These are the only other 2 statutes that apply if we remove that exemption.
If within a business, a farm, that one already gives like a 15-minute break in the morning, one in the afternoon, and an hour for lunch, do that need to be recorded in some policy at the farm in order to know that we have accommodated this type of?
It's a good practice. It's not necessarily required. It's one of those things that we would be looking to the records, the payroll records and the time records to show what breaks were given and whether they were paid or unpaid.
So if it's not written anywhere, how does one know from the Department of Labor or whatever that actually occurs? And so that's what I start going, yeah, we have practices at our farm, but if they aren't written anywhere, the assumption would be that we need to adhere to this law in exactness, like 30 minutes after 6 hours.
Sure. So I will say, I think it's always a good practice for policies to be written down. It's certainly helpful. If they are not written down, then, the inspectors, that's part of what they're doing when they do an investigation, is they're having a conversation with both employees and employers about what is your policy? Do you have one? Do you have a practice? How do you keep track of this? How do you ensure that employees are getting their breaks? Even where there is a written policy, those questions are still going to be asked because many employers have written policies that are maybe not always followed to the T. And so that's part of the investigation process.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, and I'm gonna add that, as Ann said, the employee must be offered the rest break, but they don't need to necessarily take it. But it's a good practice also to make a record that they were offered, because that's really what the requirement is.
Yes. Right. The requirement is that they have the opportunity. It is in practice, quite frequently, people don't want to take it.
I think there was a comment in the stakeholders meetings that suggested that this was an offer that could be kind of a blanket offer for an extended period of time. It wouldn't have to be an offer that's made every day or every week. It's an offer that maybe you kind of say this is an offer every 6 months or every year or something. And kind of come back to that.
Yeah, I mean, I think the specifics of how that offer has to be made are not dictated by the statute. So it could be that an employer says, you all have this opportunity, let us know if you want to take advantage of it. And if no one ever does that, the offer was made. I think, in practice, how that functions is going to vary from employer to employer.
Right. That actually plays very well into our next and final slide, additional resources. And so the first thing I would put at the top of this is, if you're in doubt, give us a call. So if you have any questions about whether a particular policy is within the law or whether your practice is within the law, give us a call. We're available by phone. You can send us an email, and we'll be happy to answer your specific questions about those things. And in addition to additional resources, we offer classes in wage and hour law. Last year, we offered about 12 of those classes throughout the state. We're adding classes again because of demand. These classes are 6 hours long, so they're very thorough. If you can't sit through one of them, again, you can contact us and ask your specific questions. But we'd be very, very happy to have you at some of those classes. And I think they're important for a lot of reasons, not just what we're talking about here today. But for that whole gamut of statutes that are good to understand as an employer in Maine. Beyond that, there are 2 resources up there, and you'll receive copies if you're on this committee. You'll receive copies of this presentation, so you'll have access to that. And if you're a member of the public, you'll have access to our webpage, which will also contain this and the other presentations. So you'll be able to click on those links, well, both of which, in addition to a lot of information, contain also the results of some surveys that were done, and admittedly a few years ago and not comprehensively, but that contain interesting information about agriculture in Maine as well, that you might want to look at as background. So I'll leave it at that, but again, I want to emphasize that we're available to answer your questions. If there are specific situations that you have concerns about, I really encourage you to give us a call or send us an email, and the contact information for the department is right, for our bureau is right there.
You offer classes for both employees and employers?
Anyone that wants to take the class is welcome to take the class. And yes, we encourage employees, workers as well.
And do you offer them in other languages or just English?
We don't unless we're requested. And if you're interested in having us teach a class with an interpreter in another language, we will try to do that. Contact us.
And Dylan, I can't tell if either Heath or Tom had questions, or we want to make sure we're including folks.
And are you able to hear me at all?
I am all set. Thank you.
We still can't hear you, Tom.
Oh, can you hear me now?
Type this question.
Then the audio's not
Yeah,
working
can you
again.
type the question, Tom? Okay. In the
So
meantime, Matt.
I just want to make sure I'm fully understanding this. So this is mainly like a talk back internalization exercise. So it's accurate to say that the vast majority of wage and hour laws already apply to individuals employed in agriculture, regardless of what we do in this work group, regardless of what was already done. Like if we just rewound 3 years or just took the world as it is today, the vast majority of wage and hour laws already apply to agricultural employees.
That's fair.
Yes.
Okay, got it. And so then essentially, as it was constructed in the last session and as we're considering it today, if we remove that exemption to subchapter 3 around minimum wages for individuals employed in agriculture, there are 3 immediate changes / implications. The minimum wage would apply, this permissive rest break language, paid, unpaid every 6 hours with some like other ways to construct that if you already do it. And then this no more than 80 hours of mandatory overtime in a consecutive 2-week period, which we'll talk more about in the future. Is that's
on the assumption that the overtime exemption would be inserted into that part.
right, which is open question, I
Right,
guess.
and just to be clear, when we say minimum wage, we mean the rest of subchapter 3.
Yep.
So that includes both minimum wage and also the pay
Other.
statements, the record keeping, the other
Yeah.
handful of things.
Got it.
Yes.
Senator Tipping, do you?
Yeah, just had a couple of questions. And Mike, I know you've provided information on investigators and numbers of investigations more broadly before in other hearings. I was wondering, first of all, are there any inspectors or investigators that are specific to agricultural employment?
There aren't inspectors. We do have a state monitor advocate, but that's a different set of laws that is involved there. So no, the short answer is no.
And I know this may be affected in part by which rules apply to them, but do you have any numbers on the numbers or on the amount of investigation or enforcement or random inspections that are done in farm worker?
We do, among farm workers?
Yeah, in agriculture.
I don't have that specific information. I can try to find it for a future session. It'd be relatively low as a proportion of all of our inspections, but I'll try to come up with that.
Appreciate it.
I think in the annual reports that we do, the numbers are broken down by industry, which was not part of this slide, but there are some numbers in that are broken down by industry. I don't know if it's by investigation or if it's by calls. I'm not exactly sure.
It's by citation, I
Okay.
think. And it is by industry, and there is a section in our latest report that does include agriculture, but I can't tell you how many that was, how many of those violations or what they were. But we'll dig a little deeper and find out.
Yeah, that'd be interesting, both the violation side and then the random inspections, any other investigatory or enforcement pieces there.
Okay.
I also was just wondering, in terms of 622 and 665, if you could just put a point on that. From what I understood from what you said, the difference was it had to be hours by day versus specific hours. And does that mean specific hours would be, they worked from 9 to 5 or whatever it is?
Yeah.
Because there seemed to be some confusion previously about the record keeping requirements. And I just want to make absolutely clear what those are and if there are any changes that are substantive to that.
Sure. So 622 requires that the employer keep a daily record of the time worked by each such employee. And then the 665 is the hours worked. So because it's minimum wage and overtime, generally hours worked is going to be the specific time. And because you have to be able to determine whether, they worked too many hours or, enough hours that they got paid overtime. Whereas daily, it doesn't necessarily have to be it can be the total number of hours worked without necessarily being the exact time. I'll double check that with our director. He's not available today, but I believe that's the way that they distinguish between those two. But generally, we're trying to determine, whether people, whether they worked, what they worked, number of hours. But the language is the daily hours versus all hours in 665.
Thank you. And that seems like the same information you need to keep just to pay people, basically.
Generally, they're pretty standard pieces of information, I think.
Can you just say, are there any other record keeping requirements that would apply?
Are there any other record keeping requirements?
It would apply if subchapter 3 was applied.
I'm gonna look at 665 just to make sure. It's the hours, it is the wages paid, and it is the itemized deductions. And then the date of the pay period, that's what's required in 665.
Which is, basically the same as 622.
Very simple.
I'm sorry, I'm maybe just a little tired, but I don't understand the difference between the daily record, like the total of time worked, or the hours. I mean, it's the same thing, right? I mean, even if you have you're punching in and you're punching out, you're still having the total hours of time worked. Right?
In most cases, yeah, I think it is going to be basically the same thing.
Okay.
Yeah. It's the two statutes use slightly different language, and I couldn't tell you why they use slightly different language, but
it's the same ultimate data set that you're getting. I mean, the same ultimate total that you're going to get.
It should be, I would hope, for most employers. I think it would be a little unusual if you had, those were coming out differently. But yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. I think Mike had his hand
Yeah,
up. Did he type it?
Yeah, I've connected with him. He's typing out his question, or his comments.
Remind us of how many total wage and hour inspectors there are currently, and how many how many businesses each of them, if you divided it Like, how many
Make me do
businesses?
math here?
On the spot.
We have eight inspectors for the entire state, and we have, what is it, 55,000 employers? So I don't know, your math is probably better than mine, but that's a lot of,
So that's.
a lot of employers per inspector, 10,000 or so. Not.
That's- I think
probably
that's 7,000.
7 or 8,000.
6,900, 6,875. So each inspector theoretically has a caseload, if it were divided equally, of nearly 7,000 businesses.
Yeah, which explains largely why we're mostly complaint responsive, although we do try to do random and other types of focused inspections as well.
I think Penny, and then we've got, do we have Mike's question?
Yeah, so it was more a comment. He was saying federal law already requires more extensive record keeping on all ag employers. This change would not add anything to existing employer obligations. And then he has a site here, see 29 USC 1821D. So, thank you, Mike.
I don't know if this is the time to bring this up, but you know, because I work in the world of hours and breaks and stuff like that, but I don't work in the world of agriculture that does more piecework. So when, how do we embed this in a statute such as this? Because then the formula becomes a bit more complex. So I don't know if this is the right time or we're gonna.
Actually, an excellent question, and we've been talking to Eric and I think Holly, and they've asked to do a specific presentation on piecework.
Good.
So if we can hold that for their presentation, that would be great.
Not Monday, but.
No, not Monday, the next meeting, the 16th, so.
Thank you.
No other questions, thank you. And so I think, yeah, next up is Director John Rohde from Workers' Comp.
Good afternoon. I am John Rohde, the Executive Director of the Workers' Compensation Board. I can be relatively brief, I think. One difference I will point out is I think all of the statutes you were just talking about are found in Title 26. Workers' Comp is a separate agency with a separate statutory scheme. Everything we deal with is in Title 39A. If you're looking for where to find more information about workers' comp. So if you can go to the next slide, it'd be great. Appreciate it. Thank you. So pursuant to the Workers' Compensation Act, employers, as you know, probably are required to purchase workers' comp insurance for their employees. And what it does in a nutshell is it provides some level of lost wage benefit as well as medical benefits if someone is injured on the job. Agricultural employers are, like every other employer, considered an employee under the Workers' Compensation Act. But unlike most other employers, there are exceptions. An employer can exempt themselves from the workers' comp requirement. And I'll get into that in a second. The burden is on the employer to establish that they meet one of the exceptions. In the next slide, this is the definition of agriculture that's in our statute. It's very similar to the Department of Labor definition of an agricultural, I think, laborer or worker, but not exactly the same. But it would cover most of what you would assume would be agriculture. And the next slide, Dylan, would be great. So here are the two exemptions. There's one for seasonal or casual laborers, and there's a separate one for agricultural laborers who are not seasonal or casual. So on the next slide, we'll see the first exemption, employees engaged in agriculture as seasonal or casual laborers. In the statute, casual is defined as occasional or incidental. I have found no case law where that's ever been applied, so I don't know what the exact definition might be. A seasonal worker is pretty much the same, I would think, based on the season of the agricultural employer. There's no limit on the number of these types of employees that an employer can have and be entitled to the exemption, but it only applies if the agricultural employer has an employer's liability insurance policy with total limits of not less than 25,000 and medical payment coverage of not less than 5,000. And the last bullet, it simply states if the agricultural employer doesn't have this policy, they are required to have a workers' compensation policy for their employees. The second exemption are for laborers who are not seasonal and casual. These would be essentially full-time employees. And the way the statute is set up, it's numerical. You can have 6 or fewer, or essentially the full-time equivalent of 6. So 240 hours per week. That can't be exceeded at any point in a 52-week period. You don't count seasonal or casual laborers. Certain family members are not included, and other members who maybe own voting stock in the company aren't required to be counted either. The coverage requirement here is still an employer's liability policy, but the limits are different. It's 100,000 multiplied by the number of full-time equivalent employees and 5,000 or more of medical coverage. Again, if that policy is not in place, the requirement is to have a workers' compensation policy. The role of the workers' compensation board then, if an agricultural for that matter, employer qualifies for the exemption, we have no jurisdiction. What happens in those situations would happen outside of the workers' compensation board. That said, if we receive an inquiry from an employer or an employee, we will check to see if the relevant employer has the policy in place and whether they qualify for the exemption. If they don't qualify for the exemption and they don't have workers' comp either, there are penalties in the workers' compensation statute that apply to all employers that can include most likely a monetary penalty for failure to secure the coverage. On the next slide, if you have questions about employers' liability policies, that's really for the Bureau of Insurance, and I've given you a couple of numbers here in the Property and Casualty Division. You can always call the board. We try to answer any questions that come our way. If we can't answer the questions, we'll try to farm them out and find somebody who can do that for you. So don't hesitate to contact us. And on the last slide, you will see my contact information, which you can use whenever you like if you have questions about workers' comp in general or employers and agriculture in particular. And that is my presentation.
So, John, again, this is a group that's looking at minimum wage. So what impact, if any, on workers' comp would covering folks by minimum wage have?
Nothing will change. It won't change the nature of the employment relationship. Either somebody is or isn't an employee, and in fact, now they are an employee. It might impact what the weekly benefit would be if somebody were injured on the job, which is based on a person's average earnings over the course of the year usually.
Can you do me a favor? Because you went really fast.
Sorry.
Can you go back to the exemption slides? Just to cover the first one and the second one again, a little bit slower.
Sure. Take a deep breath. Try again. So,
I can't read little print.
yeah, I think she can't read it either. So exactly what I said either, but
See, it really doesn't say what you said.
I think you'll have access to this. And again, feel free to call me if you have any questions. But the first exemption is for seasonal or casual laborers. No limitation on the numbers of those types of employees that can be exempted from the requirement to purchase workers' compensation, as long as you have the $25,000 employer's liability with $5,000 in medical payments. Seasonal workers are, probably the same, essentially, Department of Labor to the board, beginning or ending at the planting season, that kind of a thing. Casual laborers is in there, but there haven't been any cases that I'm aware of in Maine that would define what the difference between a casual laborer and a seasonal. If I were to guess, I would say it's someone who works occasionally and unexpectedly, and you wouldn't think that they would be returning on a regular or periodic basis, don't work for a long period of time. But that's your first set of exemptions.
What, sorry, did you say what the definition of incidental is?
That's not been fleshed out in the case law either. There are very few cases that involve agricultural employers in workers' compensation. So incidental, right? If trying to think of something, I suppose you could have a seasonal worker whose job is to work the field, but there's an irrigation type issue that might technically be considered plumbing if it were done someone else. I suppose if that's incident to the growing season, an employer could argue that doesn't take you out of the category of an agricultural employee and puts you into the category of a regular employee. That's probably what that would.
Once you trigger an exemption, is it an exemption for all employees or we're classed employees? Because it's like you got exemption, first exemption, second exemption. That's like two separate classes of employees,
Yep.
correct?
And you would have to have two separate policies potentially, depending on how they're written. This one for the seasonal or casual laborers has the $25,000 and the $5,000. Again, it covers any number of those employees. The next slide, if we're ready. Okay, would be your essentially full-time agricultural employees. And for these types of employees, it's $100,000 with the $5,000, medical coverage. The 6 employees can be 6 noses, or it can be up to 240 hours a week. So the equivalent of 6 full-time employees, if you will. And that 240 hours per week can't be exceeded at any point in the 52 weeks prior to an injury. And so there would be the need for 2 separate policies to make sure everybody is, that agricultural employer is exempt.
Everyone will get these slides after as well.
I just have this thing about the 2 different classes of employees. So on one set of employees, I can have a blanket policy, or I can have workers' comp. On the other set, meeting certain requirements, I'd have workers' comp. Just treating those 2 classes differently, and I'm not necessarily comfortable with that. So just mine to process. Yeah.
Questions, Mike, and I'm not sure if Heath is still on there.
You
have to drop- you have to drop off.
So, yeah.
Are you able to hear?
I might suggest if there are no questions, just take a poll of the group here. We have a break scheduled for after our next presentation. Do we want to take the break now or keep on talking?
Take a break now, but I just drove 3 hours from the county, so I've been in a long time.
It's good to take a break earlier to see if we can figure out the sound issue.
That's a good idea.
Okay, so what do we have?
2:10 now, we're making good time.
That's good.
So why don't we take
Director,
the 10-minute break, 10-minute, if we need to take an extra 5, just don't go too far. So.
And for folks who haven't been in the building before, restrooms are right around the corner. Thank you.
Same.
So already.
Am I trying to speak a little quick?
Senator.
I mean, you're one.
Hi, Dylan, can you hear me? I'm talking now. I'm talking now. Right.
Jody, I was told that the remote attendees that are not panelists hear us fine. It's just the folks in the room that don't.
Yeah, that's what's happening. Dylan's asking me to speak louder to see if he can hear me at all. Hi, Dylan. I'm speaking loudly now. How about this? How about this? Can you hear me now? Oh. Says he can hear me. Okay, then.
He says that he can hear you.
Yeah. Ah, yes, my God, I don't know what the heck happened. So I think, Dylan, can't hear us now? No, we can't. Nope, seems like it's one or the other. Either we're seeing the video presentation. Now we can hear you. Now we can hear you. Can you hear me? And now I can't. All right. I don't know if we are, Dylan. You may think we're good, but do you still have us muted because I can't hear them?
Well, you can, we'll see,
Okay,
this
now
is fine, it's just like drug
Can you hear
addiction.
me?
Yeah.
Hey, Dylan. I don't know that we've resolved the issue of as soon as a video presentation gets going, that you stop being able to hear us, because that seemed to be the problem last time.
I just want to say.
Well, Tom, do you feel like you're getting the essence of the presentations at a minimum? You're muted still.
I missed your question, Jody. I'm sorry.
I'm sorry. Do you feel like you're getting the essence of the presentations? And
I do. I mean, it's different not being in the room, but no, I'm getting it, and knowing that I would have liked to have had the material, but we didn't. But knowing that I can go back and look at it. So I think I'm getting an overview. Yeah.
Okay, yeah, you'll never have the presentations in advance. You'll always have them immediately after.
Right. Okay. Which I understand. It's a lot of material to get out there and
Yeah,
produce
yeah.
in a short period of time.
Okay, all right, thank you. My apologies.
No problem.
We do have one more presentation and then we're going to open things up for conversation and public input after that. One of the other issues that came up as a request for discussion was around unemployment insurance. And so the Bureau of Unemployment Compensation is here with us today, Laura Boyette, and she distributed her PowerPoint, so you should have something in front of you to look at. And again, it will be posted online and sent in the minutes as well. So Laura?
Sure. Good afternoon. As Laura just said, I'm Laura Boyette. I'm the director of the Bureau in the Department of Labor for unemployment insurance coverage. And this is going to be fairly high level because so much of what we do is individualized to a specific situation. So I'm going to probably say this a couple times. If you have questions about a specific employer or a specific farm operation, and you're not sure whether you're covered or not, please give us a call. We'd rather help you figure it out ahead of time than do a gotcha later and find out that you owe taxes. So we've got staff that are more than willing to work with you to answer any questions too on that. So, okay, you can go ahead and put that up. And go to the next slide. Okay, and these are the areas that I'd like to cover this afternoon. I do want to talk a little bit about unemployment coverage and liability for agricultural workers. What are the covered services that would lend itself to being potentially covered by this program? The criteria for being a liable employer for this program, which means you would pay taxes on some percentage of your employees' wages. And also want to just touch on H-2A workers because we get a lot of questions around that and whether they're covered. And then I believe there were some questions around seasonality, how that works for unemployment insurance program. And then if there's interest, I also have a test included in this for independent contractors. And we've written it as kind of a progressive test where you just look and answer a question. And if you ever get a no as you're going through the list of them, it's an employee. So we try to make that fairly simple on that, but I'm more than happy to go over it if there's interest in doing that. So agricultural services performed on a farm, they are covered under both state and federal law, but only under certain circumstances, and it's based on employer liability or the owner's liability. And they're potentially eligible for unemployment benefits, but again, under specific circumstances, which I will touch on that. And the liability itself is not tied to an individual's hourly rate. So the minimum changes in minimum wage don't necessarily affect whether or not an agricultural service is covered for unemployment or not. We'll go into that in a little more depth. Next slide. Yeah. So the first thing I wanted to talk about were some of the covered services. And I believe that Anne might have done this in the last meeting too. So you'll see some similarities there. Essentially, they are services that are performed on a farm that involve either cultivating the soil, raising or harvesting any agricultural, aquacultural, or horticultural commodities. And that might include some of the examples of that would be raising, shearing, feeding, caring for, training, and management of livestock, bees, poultry, and fur-bearing animals or wildlife. So also a service that might potentially be covered under our program is managing, improving, or maintaining the farm, its tools or equipment on that. Or individuals handling, planting, drying, packing, packaging, processing, grading, storing, or delivering to a storage or market, but only if the farm or the co-op that may exist produces over half of the commodity for which the services are performed. And a farm is defined for unemployment purposes as an operation that includes stock, dairy, poultry, fruit-bearing animal and truck farms, plantations, ranches, nurseries, ranges, greenhouses, or other similar structures used primarily for the raising of agricultural or horticultural commodities and orchards. But it only applies to farms that meet certain liability thresholds, which we'll work into next. So kind of the question that tends to come up to us is, when does an agricultural employer become liable under the Maine Unemployment Insurance Program? So there's two criteria, and it's an either or. It does not mean you have to meet both of these. One, it's based, it could be, the criteria could be the total quarterly wages paid either in the current year or a preceding year. If that total amount that's paid out in wages hits $20,000 or more, then the agricultural operation is considered liable, and the employer be required to pay taxes, unemployment taxes. Or, and the second one gets a little tricky, if they employ at least 10 workers performing agricultural services, some of those that we just defined, for some portion of a day in each of 20 different weeks in the current or preceding year. And the tricky part of that one, you have to kind of work through it on that. The 10 workers don't have to all be employed at the same time. So you may have 2 workers in a couple of months, 3 workers in another, and another 5 in another one. So they don't have to all be working at the same time, just the total has to equal 10 different people working for the farm during the current or preceding year. And it has to be in at least some portion of a day in each of 20 weeks that are not necessarily consecutive. So they also don't have to be working at the same time on the same day in the same week. So it kind of takes a little bit of math, and we're happy to help you figure that out. So only one of the liability thresholds must be met for an employer to be considered liable for unemployment taxes. If you are liable for it, then you need to register as an employer with the Bureau of Unemployment Compensation and pay unemployment taxes on a portion of the wages paid to your employees. And that usually raises, oh my God, how much am I going to pay in taxes? One thing about unemployment insurance, you only pay taxes on the first $12,000 paid in wages to a worker for the entire year. So if somebody earns more than $12,000 in wages, you're still only going to pay taxes on the first 12. After that, there's no taxes due. It's exempt. If someone is paid less than $12,000, you just pay it on the wages. You're only paying taxes on the wages they actually earn during that. So there is a limit on the taxes. And we get a lot of questions about H-2A workers. They are not covered under the unemployment insurance program. They were actually exempted from coverage under the Maine program by Public Law 637 in 2010.
They were covered prior to that?
Yes.
But they were exempted from coverage, but
for unemployment purposes, yeah.
but
So they would
still need to collect taxes from them?
No.
Okay, perfect. Thank you.
And you don't collect taxes from the worker. These are employer paid taxes.
sorry.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's all right. But some people think you do, so I wanted to clarify that one.
Yeah.
Mhm. Yeah. And then I get a lot of, I'm sorry, go ahead.
I just wanted to ask, does anyone in the room remember that debate in 2010 or when that bill was discussed or debated?
I was here, but I don't recall the discussions on that one, so I'm not sure exactly. It was part of a much larger bill at that time, so I don't remember it. What the arguments were for or against on that one. Seasonality. Seasonality is a little different under unemployment compensation than in other areas. A business can be considered seasonal if it customarily operates only during a regular recurring annual period of less than 26 weeks. So, but it has to be designated as seasonal, and it's designated by the Unemployment Insurance Commission, which is not the Department of Labor. It's a separate panel, that an entity that exists outside of the Department of Labor, but is also very much a part of the Maine Unemployment Insurance Commission program. They designate it. There are some that are already designated in law, and some that have been since designated through a process of investigation by the Unemployment Insurance Commission. If there's a business that is interested in becoming designated seasonal, because they work every year less than 26 weeks, they must petition the Unemployment Insurance Commission for that. The Unemployment Insurance Commission, and you can go to the next slide, they can investigate and decide something on their own if they're seeing patterns or something in an industry and they believe it should be designated that way. They can make that as an independent decision. But in most cases, it's usually they do the investigation in response to a petition by at least 5 employers of an industry requesting a seasonal designation. A request by one employer would not initiate an investigation. So it needs to be a group of employers that are requesting that for them to consider it. If a business is designated as seasonal, the employees that are hired by the seasonal business, if they work their entire season, so the employer every year will establish, these are my dates of operation, the start date and the end date. If the employee works that full seasonal period, they are not considered laid off when the period ends. So there would be no unemployment benefits based on that seasonal work. They may have other non-seasonal work during the year and a qualified separation from a different job that would cause them to be able to collect at that time, but it would not be on the seasonal business, nor would it count against the employer's experiential rate, which is what we use to establish what your unemployment tax would be. But if the employer had to let folks go prior to the end of the established season for that year, then they are eligible, they are considered laid off, and they would be potentially eligible for benefits. And any benefits that were paid out would affect the unemployed. It could potentially affect the unemployment rate because it would go against your experience. And a question I think had come up earlier about independents versus employees. Our statute, what I've written here is, this is the test we tend to use with employers to help figure it out whether or not somebody would be considered an employee or an independent contractor. And the law itself starts out with the presumption that somebody's an employee. So this, going through this test, you'll see it's always looking at, factors that would distinguish it from that. So the first big part is whether or not the individual is completely free from any direction or control of the employer or employee unit, except as to the outcome of the work on that one. And that could be either exercised or just have the right to control their work on that. So the first question you would take a look at if you're not sure about somebody that's performing services for you, are they free from direction and control? If they aren't, if you're controlling the conduct of how that work is performed, the answer there is no. You can stop right there. It's an employee because you're controlling how that work is performed. If it's yes, you can go to the next one. Does the individual have the essential right to control the means and the progress of their own work, except as to final results? If it's no, that's an employee. And then you can move on to step 3. Is the individual customer engaged in an independently established trade, occupation, profession, or business? So does this person hold themselves out as an independent business? Are they established that way? Do they market themselves as a business? If they don't, and you're the only employer they're working for, and you've gotten down here, it's probably an employee. If it's yes, they do, and they hold themselves to multiple employers out there or to a community as an independent business, then you can move on to step 4. Does the individual have the opportunity for profit and loss as a result of the services being performed? So do they have a financial investment in this? The work is not acceptable. Are they not going to get paid? You know, is there a financial investment in that work itself? If no, and it's just the wages paid by that employer, it's likely to be employees. So that would be, you'd stop right there. If yes, then there's question 5. Does the individual hire and pay his or her assistants, if any? And to the extent that these assistants are employees, do they supervise the details of their work? If no, then it's an employee. If yes, then they're more likely to be an employer themselves and need to be registered with us. So if it's yes, they have that right. They do hire and pay their own staff or their own crew. Then you can move on to number 6. Does the individual make their services available to some client or customer community, even if their right to do so is voluntarily not exercised or is temporarily restricted? Now, again, it goes back to that. Do they hold themselves out as a business to a community, a market community, or other employers and such? Now, it may be that while they're working on a project for one particular employee, they're not accepting any other work because it absorbs all their time. But if they normally can hold themselves out, even if it's periodically stopped for a particular job that they've taken, then they make it an independent contractor.
A clarifying question.
Sure.
So if there is somebody who is hired each year to work, to do a job each year, but that's the only person, the only entity that hires that person ever, then that would be an employee.
It's probably most likely to be an employee if they don't hold themselves out as an independent business. But all of these are fairly conjunctive up to this point. So what you're looking at is a progression, and they all have to be met. To be an independent contractor is a yes for all of them, or if it's no at any point in time, then it's an employee. And then this is the only place that's not not a conjunction of that sort. Number 7, there are 7 different categories listed, elements listed under this one. Move to the next slide on that one. Yeah. You only have to meet 3 for it to be an independent contractor. So you haven't gotten a no at all up to this point. And then 3 of these elements or more need to still be met in order to be considered an independent contractor. But not all 7 on those. That is actually the end of my presentation. I do want to stress, though, if you have any questions about a particular situation, whether it's a worker that's working for you or the organization, the farm itself, as to whether liability has been met, please give us a call. Again, we'd much rather work with you ahead of time up front and make sure that you've got it right, rather than come back later in an audit and find out that you've been doing it wrong for a while and have back taxes owed. So
I have a quick question.
Sure.
On meeting that liability criteria, the first one, say that you had a small family farm that didn't employ at least 10 workers. So you're looking at that first paid 20,000. Is that everybody, including family, that is working on that farm?
Everybody that's performing services that are,
Okay.
yeah. Sure.
And Mike Guar has a question as well. You're on mute.
I won't let you like.
There you go. No, you're still muted.
You're still.
While we figure this out, are you able to type in your question? Okay, great. Thank you.
And there's another question here while he's typing.
Yeah. Okay, so this may sound odd, but, okay, 20-week period, so this is under agricultural liability criteria. So employed at least 10 workers performing. So say, for example, we got a 20-week period and we know people are coming in, you hire 5 people. Or maybe you hire 6, and they go back to school and you want to hire 4 or 5 more. That's in that 20-week period. That equals 10.
Okay, keep in mind, it's not a consecutive 20 weeks. So it could be any 20 weeks throughout the year.
So that.
And yes, and it could, you don't have to have all 10 working at the same time.
Right, so they could be pockets.
They
If you're
could
a
be
really bad
scattered through the year.
employer, you're gonna have turnover and have lots of.
Yeah.
employees. So that says that really a lot of smaller businesses could meet this criteria.
Could be potentially liable, yeah.
Yep. Okay.
And this is existing law. This is not changed by, I think, looking at minimum wage or anything. So,
Yep. Thank you.
yeah.
So.
So do we have Mike's question written?
Yep, so Mike's asking, am I correct in understanding that since UI coverage is not dependent on the minimum wage, eliminating the minimum wage exemption would have no effect on existing employer liability, except to the extent that a minimum wage increase could trigger the $20,000 threshold?
You know, and it could, but you'd probably have to have an awful lot of workers for that to happen. So you'd probably be already liable under the second criteria.
And he goes on to also mention, and since we know that ag employers in Maine routinely pay at or above the minimum wage, there would be no practical effect on existing employer obligations. Right, okay. And that's all I have.
All right. Other clarification? What we've got, Laura?
Yeah, and I did put the telephone number on the last page.
Center tipping.
He stole mine, but I just say too, I understand from John's presentation that the same applies there, that changes to the minimum wage statute would not change any of the eligibility requirements or processes of either of these presentations that we've just heard, right?
Right.
Okay.
The employee test, is that specific to unemployment insurance law in Maine, or is that drawn
That's-
from elsewhere?
That's specific to us, but there's that, and it applies to all industries and workers. However, I would say that the elements that are in it are common elements that you'll find in other employment tests throughout the country.
Okay, thank you.
Sure.
And Mike, do you have another question? Your hand is still up. Okay. All right, good. No problem. We're back on track in terms of timing. And so a couple of things. I want to make sure that there's ample opportunity for general conversation amongst the committee, but it may be helpful just to see a show of hands of those in the room, in the public, who are interested in providing public comment so that we have a sense of that. I'm not able to see that from my angle. So if somebody could tell me what the number of people is.
In the room here, we could just have a show of hands of people who were planning to comment.
Nobody else says anything, it'd be real quiet.
Yeah, no hands have been raised in here, Jody, but I don't know about online.
So
And online, I'm seeing one, but I didn't explicitly ask that. So if others could raise their hand as well, if you had an interest in making a public comment, I am seeing Jason Palamo, pardon me. Okay, so we'll make sure that we get to you, Jason, but let's go back to general questions and discussion, making sure that other questions or comments are addressed by the committee.
But I'll just mention, oh, sorry, go ahead, Matt.
Nope.
Oh. I think I'll just summarize that the real intention of the first meeting as well as today was to try and give as fulsome a baseline of the current law that exists for employers of workers in agriculture in Maine. Here and now, and regardless of minimum wage implications. So that really just provides ideally an understanding of the lay of the land as it exists, and then segueing in for the next meeting where we will be talking a bit more about things that with minimum wage, we need to dig into a little bit deeper. So for instance, housing, transportation, those types of topics that are top of mind for employers generally, and if subchapter 3 does become applicable for workers in agriculture in Maine. So I know that perhaps some of this might have seemed perhaps redundant or helpful because it went into a lot of detail at this pace. So if there isn't a lot of comment, I'm going to take that hopefully as a positive because this has been helpful information. But anyway, I just wanted to put that out there in case that engendered further discussion or contemplation.
I think the other piece too, Nancy, is that we're going to distribute some data. I think folks had asked about like H2A and, you know, what information do we have at the department. So we're going to give what we have pulled together to you today and also plan to discuss that a little bit deeper next week, as well as the 2017 information. And on the presentation that Mike and Ann did, there's a link to the survey that the University of Maine did in 2021. So all of those pieces are things that folks can look at, and then if it raises any questions, we can discuss at our next meeting as well. But are there other things? And also, if there's information that you have collected that you want to share about workers or farms and what's happening there, that would be great to get that to us, and if we could think about that next week, next Monday.
Yeah, coming right up. What if we just jump to Jason briefly to get that perspective in the room and then come back to other comment. Jason, go ahead.
Oh, goodness. I just wanted to know what kind of measures were being taken to increase the amount of people who are attending that might be affected by these meetings or who would benefit from being at these meetings. That's all.
Sure. Can you tell the group who you are, please?
Jason Palomo. I work closely with Mano and Mano. I work for the University of Maine, but our community partner is Mano and Mano.
Awesome. Thank you.
That's great. And that's actually a really good question for this group to have a discussion about. I'd love to hear your thoughts. We've been thinking about should we hold one of these meetings in the evening? Would that make it easier for people to participate? Also, for those of you who were at the last meeting when we talked about our virtual meetings, and we had to, I'm sure Anna, tell me if I'm saying the wrong words here, but approve our virtual meeting policy. Basically, the state law requires that if we hold an entirely virtual meeting, that we must also provide a place for the public to show up, and that place must have a computer. So as we were, Nancy and I were talking about that, we do have virtual meetings coming up. We were thinking that we could offer sites in Machias and in Bangor at the career centers there so that the public could go. There are computers there and there would be staff there as well. So if someone was having, not that anybody would have technical difficulties because we've never experienced that. But if someone was having problems getting online, that there would at least be staff support so that folks could get online and participate. But those were the things that we had come up with, but we'd love to have some feedback from committee members about what you think we could be doing to better engage.
There was one other item which we talked about, how do people get to know even that the website exists and that the material is available for viewing, and the many, many listservs that the Department of Ag Conservation and Forestry maintain. We now are distributing notification of all the meetings and about the website to that list, which I think totals roughly 14,000 individuals engaged in agriculture in some way or another. So that was one other route, but very open to other ideas.
Okay, that prompted some additional public engagement here, so.
My name's Arlie Kraus. I'm just here. My partner is a farmer. He has Spear Farms in Nobleboro. And I'm just here, listening in and hoping to learn something. Obviously he's out farming right now. It's been an absolutely miserable year for farming, as everybody knows, but I think these are great to have these meetings, but it's absolutely impossible to expect a farmer to walk away from their fields when they have had nothing but rain this season. Now we have a dry spell that's supposed to be lasting 2 weeks. There's no hay. All the squash is rotting in the fields. It's like this expectation for people to be able to drop everything and be here is completely unreasonable. So, are you going to be allowing comment through written, something written where it's going to be looked at? I think it's just highly concerning that the most important people that we have in the state of Maine that are feeding everybody have just the smallest voice in this room. So that's just what I want to say.
Jenny Tilton Flood, I'm a dairy farmer. I'm also wondering, building upon what Jason had commented on, will there be an actual public hearing? That might be something that allows for, instead of building in time at the end of your business meeting, time for public comment, but if a public hearing were held, that could be promoted and advertised to the most important people in the food system, that would be the ag workers. To make sure that they have the availability and accessibility, especially with those satellite sites, to be able to actually be a part of this process, because as I've mentioned in previous comments, we don't have ag worker representation in this room. I can say I can speak on behalf of the people I work with, but I don't live their experience. So, and it is very difficult for those who are engaged in the work to actually leave the farm. As difficult as it is for employees have it even rougher.
Thank you. Are there other commenters that I can't see from this angle in the room?
Yeah, there's one more person in the room.
Hi, I was just adding since we're on the subject. So my name is Sean Douglas. I work at Mono Mono. And as we're talking about kind of remote participation and also making these meetings more accessible to farmers, farm workers, community members in general. There is also the option, well, I wanted to first mention the idea of having interpretation, and our aspect is our meetings are in English. Obviously, a lot of farm workers either speak only a language other than English, or English is their second language. And we are talking about also in English, pretty complex subjects. So one thing I wanted to suggest was that if we're having virtual meetings, that there is an option on Zoom to have simultaneous interpretation. You would have to have an interpreter in the meeting, but you can choose which language you want the meeting interpreted in. And then there's like, it adjusts the audio feed so you hear the language that you select. And then when someone else is speaking in that language, you hear the main audio. So just wanted to say that that is an option. We use it pretty frequently at Mono a Mono, like all of our board meetings, we have simultaneous interpretation on Zoom. So just wanted to say that that's an option as well.
Great. Thank you. Any comments that the committee itself would like to add about access, either in response to the public comments that they heard or otherwise? We have the next 2 meetings coming up are entirely virtual. Then the 5th is in person, the 6th is virtual again, and the last one is in person. So there are 3 meetings coming up that are entirely virtual. I would note just if you do go to the website, just in partial response to a couple of comments made, absolutely written comments are very, very welcome. And there is a website address, there's an email address on the website encouraging any comments to be submitted in written form to be shared with the committee. So I just want to make sure that that's very clear to everyone present.
And Jody, do you happen to know the email address off the top of your head, or?
Dylan does. I'm gonna punt to him.
So it's agminwage.dol@maine.gov. And I'll also pop it into the chat for our online friends.
It's at the top of the agenda of today's meeting as well. I just yeah, it's funny. Dylan, I'm seeing a simpler minimum, a simpler website address that's listed on the agenda. So I'm not quite sure what the difference is.
One's an email, one's a website. I'm not.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yep. Okay, but we'll put that in the chat, and for those who already have the agenda, the website is on the agenda. And if you go into that website, you can find the email address to submit all public comment. So let me turn it back to the room.
Thank you.
I was just gonna ask, sort of in the spirit of really wanting vibrant public participation, in terms of this period of time between the final meeting on November 27th and then submitting language to the governor on December 1st. What's the plan in terms of the potential for public input there? Like, is there an opportunity to maybe put something out in terms of these are our committee recommendations and then take a pulse from the public in terms of how that's sitting, particularly with impacted constituents?
I don't think that's something that we discussed, but I hear your that offer.
Can I float an idea? And this really just, excuse me, depends on this pace at which this committee feels like it can do its work. But one of the thoughts was to have, the general outline of a bill available for discussion at the next meeting to, once we have all of this background information provided, so that if you had a target of your second to last meeting being where you internally finalize what you would ideally like to be putting forward to the governor's office, that would be November 13th. And what it would allow for is an opportunity for, potentially more substantive public comment for that following week, so that you could be taking that all into consideration at your last meeting on the 27th and making final decisions at that meeting. So basically, you know, bumping forward, if you will, your near final thinking to November 13th, and that would, you know, give the public a more solid document to be responding to. Just one thought.
Okay, and then we've got Heather and then Senator Timberlake.
Yeah, I just thank you, Shelley and Jody. I was just thinking that the suggestion of having an evening gathering of some sort that we could all participate. I certainly would be willing to adjust my schedule to participate in something like that if more of the impacted stakeholders could participate. I don't know how that sits with everybody else, but I think that might be something we want to consider adjusting the schedule. And then just thinking about the 13th of November, Thanksgiving holiday falls in between those two meetings, and that might be a little tricky for people. It might be a good thing. I don't know, but it's just, you know, that time of year can be a little tricky to get stuff done.
Senator?
Yeah, and I'm on the same way, but I'm looking for public input on my end and figuring out how we get that. Because I had because somebody's done a good job of getting stuff out to farmers and at least letting them know this is going on. Because I've had numerous calls, are you going? And that's why I'm setting my butt here this afternoon. Because we are picking apples on like the first sunny week we had in a long time, but I think it's important that somewhere along the way, you figure out how you have a public meeting that the public gets to come in and speak. And it's not about you, just like we have when Senator Tipping had it in front of his committee. I think it's very important that people get, but I don't think you should have it till you have the bill pretty well done. So people know you're not working on speculation of what you think is in the bill or what is in the bill. I think it's very important that people are very concerned that this is happening behind closed doors. I'm not saying that it is because I don't think it is. But most farmers between now and the first frost are working 7 days a week, 12 to 20 hours a day. And they're going to keep doing that until basically sometime mid-November. And then as Heather said, you're going to be into Thanksgiving. I would hope that sometime before you schedule it out, the 1st of December, you may have to jockey your plans a little because as a legislator, whether you present a bill to the governor on December 1st or December 15th isn't going to make a darn bit of difference of what happens at the legislative level because we're not going in until January and nothing's going to happen until then. But somewhere in there, I think you folks have to really figure out how the farming industry and the workers of the farm industry all have a right to get before you like they did before with what you got proposed, not what you think you're going to propose, how you think it's going to work. It's with what you're going to propose because we can all work on speculation. And I don't think that's a good idea. So that's just my input of where I think you're headed. And I thought today was good.
Thank you. Thank you, Senator.
Yeah.
Just to flag, so everybody's on the same page, and correct me if I'm wrong, my understanding is that assuming a bill does come forward from the governor on this, obviously that bill would have a normal public hearing process before the Labor and Housing Committee and people would have. So I think I'm not disagreeing at all with the desire for public input. I think it's just worth thinking about just making sure people know that whatever, if something comes forward from the governor on this, it will follow a normal legislative process.
Could I respond to that? I think that's a fine statement, but what got us here is the fact that there wasn't a lot of public input up front. People aren't trusting the legislative process right now. And so my position is as much public input as we can get before it goes to the governor, people are going to have a better feel for, I had my input, they heard me. now they'll be more comfortable as it goes through the process that isn't feeling comfortable to people.
Short but sweet. I would say to Matt that I would think the governor would want to know what the public's input on the bill that she was about to put forward. Before it went forward, I would think after you got ready, she would at least want to know what the public thinks about what she's about to do. At least I would if I was a governor.
Okay, and I can't, Senator.
I just wanted to say I appreciate this focus and I want to thank all of the farmers, farm workers, and everyone else that turned out for the full day of public hearings that we did have on this earlier this year. I think it's very important that those voices are recognized, that input is understood, and those concerns are heard.
Jody, I can't tell if there's anyone online or any of the other committee members who need to say something or would like to say something.
Yes, I'm seeing one more public member, and that is Garrett Sorber. And if you could just identify yourself.
Hi, I'm Garrett Silver. I'm a farm worker and I have a nursery as well. I just think it's just absolutely wild that we're here just talking about this and the fact that it's not even law already. It's pretty wild to me. So, you know, that's coming from a farm worker and someone who owns a business too. You know, like I say, rising tide lifts all boats. So, rise the tide.
Thank you. I am not seeing other public comment, at least online, with hands raised.
Take an informal poll of our advisory committee members here about being open to an evening or alternative timeframe for meetings. Details to be determined, of course, but is that something we generally can embrace and work out and work through? And how about the next question, non-Augusta centric location if we were to be elsewhere? Perhaps you could provide feedback as to limitations on where you'd be able to get to within a certain amount of driving. Thank you to folks who are coming from afar. Augusta is not exactly in the center of everything, as much as sometimes we feel like it's the center of the universe for parts of the year. So anyway, we should be thoughtful about if there's some other locations. So if you could provide feedback to us or to Dylan, that would be really helpful. Were there any other discussion topics before we wrap up? Jody, any remarks on your end?
No. No.
Now we can't hear you. What's happened? What's happened to you?
I don't know.
Oh, you take that. Now we can hear you.
Okay. No, I think, you know, one of the things candidly that I'm grappling with is if we want to absolutely maximize public input, which I know we do, is moving the meeting to one other location in the state the solution, when it will be closer for some people and then it will be far for a lot of other people. So it may make sense to do it anyway, but I don't think it alone certainly solves the problem. A different time of day, I agree, can always bring in different people who are busier during the day than in the evening. So that seems like it's valuable. But again, I think that somehow making sure that whatever document you all come up with is available for reaction with enough time for people to have that input, whether it's in person or or in writing. I'm not sure. Maybe that matters to a lot of people. I think substantively, what we really need is the feedback in whatever form is easiest for people to provide it in.
Yeah, so I think I heard kind of at least three things. One is that yes, as a group, we're interested in doing whatever we can to engage both farmers and farm workers and get their voices here. That the information is being widely distributed about these meetings through the normal DACF channels. So it went out to
13 something.
thousand
Yep, 13,000.
people.
Yep.
So we are, yeah, as well as having information on the website and Department of Labor pushing it out as well. The website does have a place to submit written comments, but we'll make sure that that is stressed and emphasized so that people know that. I heard the piece about translation as well. If we're doing something publicly and we really want to make sure that folks are able to engage in a meaningful way in this process. And then the other piece I also heard is get whatever the proposal is out there for people to be able to understand clearly what's being said and then get their feedback on that instead of just floating kind of possibilities. And the different locations, it sounded like having that available to the public is maybe okay and maybe not okay, but the different time of day folks were interested in. Is that accurate or? Okay.
Had you thought about, the separate location, I think you can kind of build off that, because if we can get the technology to work and you guys can split up and maybe Nancy's at a location, you're at a location and somebody else is at another. So you've got 3 sites going on at the same time. It take orchestration, so you need lots of good technology support. But
you see how great.
but basically, we know that the technology is there. We know that people have done satellite meetings before, and that as long as the people in the different locations know how they want to facilitate it, then each group area is going to be engaged in the process. But it would require, I think it requires the kind of the chairs or the leaders to separate into those locations.
Well, that's a good idea, Penny. Okay.
I just had one thing to add. I just want to just really stress this. Farmers cannot show up to these meetings. They do not have the time. Their entire everything is on the line right now. I know that. I grew up farming. My family had a huge legacy farm in Massachusetts, and that's what I grew up doing. I know that every single day is absolutely critical, whether you're an owner or a farm worker. Right now, because we have some good weather, people are not going to leave their farms. I just want to ask, is testimony that is submitted written, and I know I've asked this before, does it hold the same weight that being in person will hold? And I certainly hope it does, because you have people that is the only way they're going to be able to submit. They cannot be listening to this stuff while they're driving a tractor, out in a field somewhere dealing with like 8,000 breakdowns and broken equipment. It's just not going to happen. So it's just imperative, because this is the industry that you guys are talking about regulating, that we really accommodate these folks, no matter if you're a farm worker or you are an owner of a farm. So that, I think it sounds really wonderful to say that you're going to be able to have a satellite office available. Practically speaking, I don't think it's going to happen.
No, I appreciate that. And yes, anything that we receive has equal weight. It's not that in order to be heard, you have to physically show up.
And we'll be sure I'm remembering a different public effort on a different subject 2 years ago, which Jody helped facilitate, where written comments were disseminated in advance to all members of the committee so that we had a chance to look at it. We even put time on our schedule to make sure that we were recognizing that. So these aren't going to get filed away somewhere. They will see the light of day and be absolutely taken very seriously. Thank you. Right. Well, before we go, we'll distribute the data and you can certainly add that to your homework for thinking through for next Monday. Unless there are any other comments, questions. And adjourn. Thank you for your time today and for the members of the public. And your patience with technology.
That was one, but yes, yes. Yes.
Thank you all.
Yeah.
Thanks, Tom. Thanks, Mike.
So trying to figure that all out. This is fun and yeah, but it's good.
Together for 2 hours. I'm gonna get to
You're trying to talk.
Still have your email. Right. Yeah, it's gonna be. So I can ground.
Now I'm slinging baked potatoes.
No. Yeah, I want to be back. I'm gonna be back on Sunday. We started harvest. That following Monday, so I'm gonna be back. Yeah, yeah, everything's big. For me, early generation seed. They're a little oversized. No, but a lot of our growers want, you know what I mean, the smaller seed and some of them put in the ground quite big, but I have to cut them and stuff. Yeah, actually, they'll just plant them, you know what I mean? Yeah, we ended up though, last week, we spent more time in the truck. Yeah, out of the mud, that's fun. I think in a 10-hour day on Thursday, probably 7 of it, just pulling trucks out of a 10-hour day. Like it was, I think we got 3 loads out of the. If it wasn't the trucks, it was the harvester, and I'm like, oh. Yeah, we had 2 tractors just pulling out trucks, and I'm like, it was terrible. Yeah.